Welcome, Dr. Krey, to our campus. It's great to see our students out. Thank you very, very much for coming out, and thank you, faculty colleagues, for all you did to get them here. Thank you so very, very much.
To make sure my mic works, and it does work. Thank you for your hospitality, President Nunes. It's good to be here. I'm honored to be here.
So looking forward to this conversation. This is the 70th anniversary year of the composition of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So 1948, it was written, and it fits perfectly well with our theme, Borders and Boundaries, here at Concordia College. And when we asked you, Dr. Krey, to speak, you sent us as a theme for your visit tonight, something there is that does not love a wall. And I'd like to quote the reference that you used for that theme, and it is a poem by Robert Frost called Mending Wall. And a little excerpt from that poem. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. Why did you choose this theme?
I chose that because I knew that the issue of immigration would come up, and refugees would be on your minds, and the intent, of our administration to build a wall to keep them out. And as a pastor and one who taught at a seminary, first of all, I looked at President Nunes's welcome. Right? Have you all looked at his the web page and the home page? You should. And there, the passages from Exodus, you shall not oppress the sojourner. You know the heart of the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And I was reminded when I read that of a passage in Leviticus. This is a church-related college, right? So I know you know this all by heart. So now I should, having made fun, I should open to the right page. Here from Leviticus, one of your favorite books. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord, your God. And so I thought about Robert Frost's image of the wall, and in this poem, which from your poetry classes you all know by heart, right? Along with stopping by woods on a snowy evening, right? And but he does grant that borders are important. When the cows, his cows, are on the other side of his neighbor's fields that have apples, right? So if the cows are going to eat the apples, there is a reason for a wall, right? But not in a place where the pine cones, might come over and raid the apples, because they're just not going to do that, right? But this Stone Age savage of a neighbor keeps saying good fences make good neighbors, right? And he wants to repair this wall that nature destroys, hunters destroy, people destroy, right? And sometimes they have to cast a spell, on the stone, because it just doesn't want to stay there. It falls down as soon as they build the wall. So there are purposes for walls, but he wants to know, as President Nunes read, what he's walling in and what he's walling out. And our Judeo-Christian tradition, and the Islamic tradition as well, which emphasizes hospitality, right, says to all of us that refugees people who are fleeing their countries, oftentimes because of gangs who have been created because Americans buy drugs. So it's not as if we're not implicated. It's not as if we're not complicit. I am a preacher. As if we're not complicit in this dilemma, right? They are fleeing, and we treat them as criminals, right? And want to wall them out. That our tradition does not allow for that. We are contrary to the tradition, and what we're focusing on today, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was written after the Great Depression and after the tyranny of the Axis powers, right, in Europe, after the consequences of nationalism. Let's just put it out there. Nationalism always results in war and violence, right? So after the consequences of all that, Eleanor Roosevelt, former faculty member of our school, Fred Nolde, and John Foster Dulles, and many others, right? Muslims, Jews, right? So they weren't, President Nunes and I talked a little bit before, they weren't all white males, right? Eleanor Roosevelt was a part of it. But they put together, this UN declaration, and one of them is that people have a right to leave their country. People have a right to return to their country at will. People have a right to leave when they are, so in other words, they are granted asylum, right? When they feel oppressed in their own country, and states are not allowed to keep them away.
Okay,
right?
so before we get to, and you've just introduced just a potpourri of topics.
You bet.
So we're going to talk about nationalism. We're going to come back to that.
Okay.
We're going to talk about 7,000 plus people trekking northward to our southern border.
Right.
But before we get to that, let's go back to walls.
You got it.
So when I think of walls, I think of the kind of function and the role of walls in many places around the world. In Palestine, Bethlehem, there is a wall.
Right.
There is a wall that formerly stood in Germany.
Right.
There is a in Berlin, to be specific. There's a Great Wall that was constructed around China. How are we to think sort of philosophically about walls?
So if one thinks about the Great Wall of China, right, that was built to keep, right, the hordes out, to protect a civilization, and lasted a long time. Even though you can just about step over it, right?
Right.
There's a wall that was built in northern England, right, to separate
the Hadrian's
Wall,
right.
Separating colonized
Roman
Roman
Empire,
province
right.
from some of your
Right.
ancestors, not all of them, and you could step over it. It was that was that. So there is philosophically there is a reason for boundaries, right? Every nation needs that. Every farm needs it. Just walking up here, right? There are retaining walls, right? That hold up ground so that there isn't erosion. There is a necessity for a wall, but I was thinking about the fact that, again, another thing you all know so well, eschatologically, in the book of Revelation, there is a wall that John the prophet describes, taking it from Ezekiel, but the gates are open. They are not shut. And they're open in Revelation chapter 22, or it might be 21, so that the nations of the world can come through them. So our Judeo-Christian tradition, and in many ways the Islamic tradition, is a universal tradition. Whether you look at Isaiah the prophet, or the book of Acts, or the book of Revelation, our vision is a global vision, and if there have to be walls, they are open.
So, and we should interrogate the walls then. and
Exactly.
ask them, who are they keeping out? Who are they walling in?
Exactly.
Who are they walling out?
Exactly.
And ask questions. It's not whether or not there are
Right.
walls.
And they are going to fall, like the wall around Jericho, right? And they're going to fall with people.
Yeah.
People, that's what happened to the Berlin Wall, right?
Yeah.
People
People's Revolution, right,
protesting.
right.
You know, finally they stood on that wall after so many were shot there and killed, right? They lost their fear of the wall. And if we build one between us and Mexico, I guarantee you people are going to take it down.
Okay, so let's go to the question of our southern border and the front page of the New York Times and the story of these 7,000 persons and their families and their children trekking northward. And how are we to think of them?
So we are to think of them, President Nunes, without hypocrisy. I'm a first generation immigrant of a family that were refugees from World War II. And my mother in her diary describes hordes of people fleeing the advancing Russians, you know, from the east in ox carts, in little vehicles, and the ox carts were falling apart in the cold of winter. Now there it's hot and dry. This was in the cold of winter, right? Fleeing something they feared, right? Not for, necessarily economic reasons, which a lot of our ancestors would have come over for, right? My parents immigrated in one way for economic reasons, right? And so what we have to do, I think, is look at these 7,000 persons coming with empathy and without hypocrisy, because if we remember, like the scriptures admonish us, right, that we are also part of a tradition where people had to flee, right, then we can understand who they are.
So I've read words like, the invasion of the United States from the South. I've read that in some popular press and on some social media. What's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is that, we just have to remember the Irish invasion. We have to remember the Italian invasion. We have to remember the German invasion. The English were not very pleased in Philadelphia when so many beer-drinking, irresponsible Germans came and had overcrowded tenement houses. My father was a pastor.
German ghettos.
German ghettos, yeah. My father was, not all of you are familiar with the Missouri Synod. This has some connections to the school, right? Strong connections with the Missouri Synod. My father was brought over by the Missouri Synod in a parish, and he said half of his parishioners were one step ahead of jail in Germany. And that's why they were they were on the run, right? So come on, right? I was arguing with one of my parishioners the other day. I'm very mild-mannered. John knows, President Nunes knows. I never argue. But he was talking about this invasion, right?
So the current Hondurans.
Coming up from the south, right? And how awful this is, right? And that we need walls, we need borders, right? The troops should go down as they are, right, to protect us. So I interrogated him a little bit. Where does your family come from? Oh, they came from Germany. Yes, and did they come legally? Well, my grandfather was advised to jump ship as it was coming into the harbor.
Because so landing at Ellis Island here.
Yeah, but
and he jumped early.
He jumped early.
Swam to.
Give me a break, right? It's just simply that we're not being faithful to our tradition. That doesn't mean it doesn't have to be managed, right? It doesn't mean that, it doesn't have to be regulated, right? But, my mother came to this country stateless because she was born in
That was
Poland.
her classification.
Her classification on the ship's manifest indicates that she was stateless. And it's because she was born in Poland of German parents.
Right.
But because she was born in Poland, she wasn't allowed to come to this country up to 10 years after the rest of the family.
So let's go back to this document.
Go ahead.
Okay, so UN Declaration of Human Rights. Is the United States of America a signatory of this document? Have
It
we signed
wasn't.
on?
It wasn't at the beginning, because we were so afraid that if we tortured soldiers, that our soldiers would be implicated in wars. And there is an article
right?
against torture, right? As a nation, we were so afraid of that we were one of 8 countries, along with Saudi Arabia, China, the Soviet Union, South Africa during its apartheid days, right?
So South Africa refused to sign it, and so
South
did we
Africa, and so did
initially.
we. And under President Carter, right, it was signed.
So that's
and then
in the 70s now.
In the 70s, and under President Bush, it was ratified. So only, so
if we've signed this document, how does that implicate us in terms of our participation in the world?
Well, I think that's what is part of all of our responsibility, right, as learned persons, right, with liberal arts educations, or hopefully, we'll get liberal arts educations, that we have an obligation, to the tradition in the West out of which this comes, right, and we can talk about issues related to that. That this is a contribution of Western values, which are global, which are democratic, right? And they invite, our tradition invites dissent. That's why this college comes out of the Reformation tradition, right? If we don't allow for dissent, right?
When Lutherans broke away from the Roman Catholic
exactly,
Church,
exactly,
500 years ago last year.
exactly. Right. That we need to value a sense of our being part of a global. That's why it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? So if our administration is acting contrary to that
you
which
mean
we
of the United States,
of the
not
United
this
States,
college,
right? Not of this college. That would never happen, right? But if the administration of this country is operating contrary to that which we have signed, then I think we all have the responsibility to dissent. We all have the responsibility to say clearly that the United States is not, off the planet. That we're on the globe, right? And this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what happens here affects, what happens, in Latin America. What happens in Latin America is affecting us, and that, back to the wall and borders, that has to be negotiated with conversation and diplomacy, not with troops.
Got it.
Not with walls.
Got it. Okay, so a reporter from the Washington Post last week named Jamal Khashoggi was in Turkey and was killed, allegedly by the Saudis. Does this document speak to that situation?
Yes, one of the articles clearly states that torture is forbidden, that it is just not allowable. So what the United States did in Guantanamo, right, was a rupture of this, and we heard about that, right, both internally and externally, and rightfully should have, because this is a universal declaration, right, approved by the United Nations, and we signed on to it, so we broke, right, a value system that we had signed on to. But what also is encouraged by this this document is that the community of nations will create pressure on a nation state that engages in torture and murder, right, of somebody who is engaged in dissent.
Or exercising his right of freedom of the press. for example,
Exercising
like
his right of
free
freedom of the
speech,
press and the freedom of dissent, right? So, one of the things that one might notice is that where this current administration sort of gave license to the Saudis, saying, we are not going to hold you accountable for human rights, and look at the consequence, right, of those words and that license. But what you're also noticing is a lot of businesses around the world that have accepted this democratic, global, some would even say liberal democratic, in the best sense of the word liberal, right? This set of articles about human rights, a lot of businesses are saying, we're not going to do business with Saudi Arabia. And they will pay a price, right? And there'll be other nations, especially European nations, who will make them pay a price, for what they have done.
Okay, so I realize we're a part of the world that's geographically undeniable. But we have enough.
Some people wouldn't think so, President Nunes.
We have enough problems of our own here. We got an opioid crisis. We have I read a statistic recently that among 18 to 40-year-old men, 1 out of every 6 has meaningfully checked out of any participation in an employment search.
Right.
So it's just, chronically unemployed. We've got pockets of poverty that persist in the nation. We've got lots of issues we got to deal with here. Should we not prioritize our own issues and get our sort of own house in order before we go kind of meandering off to fix the world?
I think that's a very important question. If we look at it historically, we tried isolation in the past, right? And the world,
so as a foreign policy,
and the world, went into turmoil, and we paid for it with our own lives. So there's a consequence for isolationism as a foreign policy. Nonetheless, it is important to take care, of one's own. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," right? Not love your neighbor more than yourself, right? But love your neighbor as yourself. So I would say we have enough resources here to take care of those whom you just described, right? Who are underemployed or unemployed or have given up, unemployment. On the other hand, one of the things that I learned from you, President Nunes, in the course that we taught together, is that these human rights, this Declaration of Universal Human Rights, also requires sacrifice. That, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that the UN Millennial Goals, right, which involve globalization, raised 1 billion people out of abject poverty in the world.
So extreme poverty measured by people living on less than $1.25 per day.
Right.
And 1 billion people were raised out of that due to the Millennium Development Goals.
Right. And globalization was part of that, right? So that does mean that some of our jobs will have gone and have gone overseas, right? So that many people around the world, right, will have not had to live on less than $1 or less than $1.25 a day. So my answer to you, President Nunes, is I think we can do both. I don't.
So it's not an either-or proposition.
It's not an either-or proposition. That we can care for our own and allow the rest of the world to have their living standards rise, right, at the same time.
I was talking to a young man just as we were gathering here, and he shared with me that 7 years ago in Westchester County, his father, who is African American, was shot and killed by a police officer. And that this has been an untried and uninvestigated shooting. There still are obviously the lingering impact of racism here in the United States, and questions of justice in our own nation. How does this apply to us here in the U.S.? I mean, you can sign on all you want. Do these principles work here in the U.S.? That's question A. And question B is, how do you define justice, in case you decide to have that as a part of your answer?
I'll take that one first. One of my teachers defined justice, according, again, because it's a simple one. When President Nunes and I taught this course, we read one book called Six Theories of Justice, right? Then we read a book by Sen, which an Asian scholar, Martin Sen, right, who argues that you can have a liberal democratic society and still have justice in the world and economic prosperity at the same time, right? But Dr. Lazarus at our school taught that justice is when you love more than one person. So if Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, right, which comes from Leviticus, right? He just stole it from Leviticus, right? So it's from the Jewish.
So you're saying Jesus stole?
He borrowed.
Oh,
he borrowed
okay.
President Nunes. So it's simply a rehearsal, right, of what Jewish teaching was, right? But Dr. Lazarus said it gets more complex when you have to love more than one neighbor, right? And especially when you have to love someone who is different than yourself. Now, I've already said that the apocalyptic vision is universal. The end is universal, right? And we will have to, we're all going to have to live together someday in the future reign. So we'd better start now, what you're already doing in this wonderful college, right? Which is so diverse. I'm sure there's some complications at times, but therefore, in the Universal Declaration, it also means that every individual's rights are important. So if one is a minority, right, or a person of color, right, your individual rights are just as important as mine, because each of us is created, right?
With essential dignity.
With essential dignity, right? Each of us is created with rights. You know that Thomas Jefferson, one essayist about writing on this, said that Thomas Jefferson writes that famous passage, right, in the Bill of Rights, right, and had slaves. So there's an inherent contradiction, right, in our own tradition here in the United States. But this Universal Declaration is a Bill of Rights for the world, and I think it would give us all. It should give us all confidence in the light of the story that you said, right, to dissent, to protest, to just simply say out as a result of because of justice that there's this current day lynching of African Americans is not appropriate. That it's outrageous, and just because it's institutionalized, that does not mean it's not happening.
Got it.
Right? And all of us who are part of a liberal arts tradition have a responsibility. Democracy involves responsibility. End on this, President Nunes. Adlai Stevenson said, the natural order for humanity is dictatorship and tyranny. Democracy is unnatural. Therefore, it has to be tended with the responsibility of its citizens. Isn't that interesting?
That means active participation.
Active participation.
That means voting.
Voting.
Yes, okay.
And not apathy.
Yeah. So in fact, it's interesting, in the Greek language, there's a word that's used to describe those who check out of participation in the civic realm or in the political processes. And they're called, in Greek, it's idiotes, from which we get the word
idiots.
Yeah, very good. That's it. That's a fact. Okay.
That's a fact.
One of the reasons I was so drawn to come to Concordia as president had to do with the amazing diversity here.
Right.
Sort of what kind of God has done in this place is just irreplicable, and it's a beautiful thing.
Right.
And it's a thing from which we have a immeasurable opportunity to learn how to live together, and create a kind of beloved community that doesn't exist in the world as it currently is fashioned. You did the same thing at Philadelphia Seminary, where you were president. You had a school that You were 17 years there as president, and you really inculcated there a great sense of diversity and respect across difference. And yet humans struggle so much to be respectful across difference. One of the great things about this day here at Concordia is we've had a day of dialogue,
Right.
and we dealt with some really difficult topics, and we had difficult conversations across difference.
Right.
On the Me Too movement, on whether or not there should be universal health care, and on social media and what it sort of does. My question to you is, why do humans struggle in dealing with people who are different?
Let me tell you a positive story, and maybe I can get around. The person I study a lot is St. Augustine, and St. Augustine said, so if you tried to follow me, and President Nunes tries to keep me in line, right? Augustine, the great African theologian, right, said that there are two ways to get to a top of a mountain. One is to go around, and the other is to go straight up, right? And I tend to go around. He said, you get to the top both ways. But when I went to a university, University of Massachusetts at Boston, which was very much like this. It was created for the Boston community. And I was a suburbanite, but you had to fight to get in as a suburbanite because it was supposed to serve the Boston community, which was very diverse at that time. And the dean gave us this assignment as we started. He said, I want you to find somebody who is extremely different from you. So different that that person is scary. And I want you to make that person your friend. And I did that with an African-American student who had come from Mississippi and who had witnessed the bombing of the 3 little girls. And he was so angry at white America. He was so angry when there was a parade or when the flag would come by. And this is a long time ago, President Nunes, right? That he could not attend a parade, right? That's how angry he was as a result of what he saw in his hometown, right? And I became a close friend of his and learned to appreciate his righteous anger and learn to respect that, not to become defensive. And I think this is why we're afraid, right, to cross lines, because we're afraid of people's difference. We're afraid of their anger, and we don't recognize in them our common humanity, which is exactly what this is a product of. This is a product of the Renaissance, which began to invite everybody to recognize, the Renaissance? Invited everyone to recognize their common humanity. And I think that's what scares us about differences, because we don't expect to find something common. I'll end with this. I'm a historian, and a great historian once said that in order to understand what's common, you first have to recognize difference. Don't just brush over, right, the difference, but recognize the difference first, and then you will suddenly see that which is common. So we have to be careful that, especially if we're white, right, that we don't immediately just sort of patronize or colonize or impose, right? But that we recognize that there's difference, as I did with my friend who was furious, right? Only then to get to a real deep friendship and appreciation, because we both had something in common.
So this is my final question, and then we'll go to Q&A with the room. Concordia College was the 3 primary buildings, Boehm, Seeker, and Feth Halls on White Plains Road, were designed by an architect named Edward Lippincott Tilton. And he's the same architect, since we're here speaking about immigration, who also designed the main building on Ellis Island. So we like to say that baked into the bricks of our campus is this kind of sense of hospitality and this sense of welcome. and what you described as a Christian or Judeo-Christian and Muslim virtue
Right.
of hospitality and welcome. What can students do in 2018 to extend that hospitality and welcome, not only here in the United States, but around the world?
So what I would say is that if you've heard my argument that this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a product of the Western liberal tradition that begins in the Renaissance, that emphasizes our common human nature, our common dignity, right? But also values dissent, and also values science and learning, right? So that if scientists say that we're experiencing climate change, right? We don't just deny that because you're learning something, and the important thing is that what I want all of you to do is realize that your learning transcends your locality. Your learning transcends your liberal arts learning, right? Or your scientific learning transcends your parochial, provincial interests. And that's,
or even your topic area or your professional
exactly.
career goal. Or,
exactly. So and that will be a gift to the world around you. Because there's so much of our world right now that wants to deny, the Western liberal arts tradition. Notice the word liberal is in there. It wants to deny that in the face of self-interest, right? Or in the face of short-term interest. You're learning things over the long durée, over the long period of time, and you need to value that and preach the way we preachers do, to the people around you, so that they just might listen. As Jesus says, the one who has ears to hear, let them hear. The other thing, and I was not asked to say this, but having been a president of a church-related institution, I want all of you who are students or any of you who are alums, or maybe you're just friends of the school, to pledge that you will support this enterprise when you graduate or even now, because it is very fragile. I don't know if you know, there are enemies now of what you're learning because they would rather keep you dumb and stupid. They would rather you didn't know, right? Your rights, or the world's rights, or your integrity, right? Your dignity. Or the fact that you have, and I'm almost done, President Nunes, that you have capacity.
Yeah.
And that you will be accountable because you have learning. This I learned from President Nunes in the class, right? That you will be a responsible citizen, but part of being a responsible citizen is to be generous, to the institutions that give you the opportunities that all of you will have. I'm done.
Phil, you're awesome. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. That was really, really cool. So we can open it up for questions. And I know this man. He's a mentor and a friend, and there's nothing off limits, so you can ask anything. Summer Nasser. Summer has actually spoken before the United Nations on the topic of Yemeni interests and issues there. And so could you get the mic to her, please? Thanks so much.
Thank you for the amazing talk.
If you hold the mic right up to you, yeah, thanks.
Thanks for the amazing talk, and you really touched upon multiple fronts that we're dealing with during this crisis as a nation, unfortunately. There are a few things that I think, or just one comment and then a question. As someone who's constantly at the United Nations and speaks with various entities and countries, I I noticed even within the United Nations there are divisions, there are borders, there are groups that don't communicate with each other because one supports something versus the other. So how can we as people who are basic citizens and just really want to go forward with the declaration, how can we change that slowly, even as the next generation comes through? So that's
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. First of all, I think you know that the ones who put this together, who were committed to it, had to work for years.
That's right.
For years to get it together, and actually, it came very close to failing, and one of the things that happened was that friendships developed across interfaith lines, right? So for the article number 18, which the faculty member from our school wrote in part, what was going to fail because a lot of radical Muslim countries, I shouldn't say radical, but a lot of Muslim countries didn't like the idea of a freedom of religion, right? And freedom of conscience, right? And friendships got to be so deep that a Muslim stood up to defend the article. I mean, now just think about that, right? So part of what, when President Nunes asked about difference, right? Part of what I think you can do in a community like this is develop deep friendships
Across difference.
Difference that will break down those walls. Does that make sense, right? And then also know that little steps, like happened here, right? Little steps will take, take one a long way. And finally, it also takes courage.
Yeah.
Eleanor Roosevelt, Alfred Nolde, John Foster Dulles had to be courageous, sometimes over against their own administrations, to do what they did. So just three, quick responses to a wonderful question.
That's a great. May I add? I was talking to a student recently who's become very frustrated because the cause about which she cares has been railroaded more than once. And I remembered, and this is what I said to her on Monday, I remembered when I was in college in the early 80s. And I went to a small school called Concordia College in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we were seen as campus radicals, some of us, because we were protesting about apartheid. Because in those days, right, South Africa was an apartheid nation, and there were a lot of people defending apartheid, and there were government sanctions against apartheid, and apartheid was in effect in the early 80s. Another thing we kind of protested against was in the early 80s was Martin Luther King Day was not yet a holiday. It had not yet been signed into holiday until 1986, when ironically President Ronald Reagan signed King Day into a holiday. But when I look at what's happened between the early 80s and now, it's just stunning to me. Where is apartheid, right? Where is we've had a president named Barack Hussein Obama who's been re-elected president of the United States twice. Okay, so change is a process, not an event, and it takes resilience, and you got to stick with it. But being old, I've got the retrospect, and when you stick with it, you can see the difference that you can make over time. Another question. Sir.
Hi. I was just wondering about the North Korean wall that not only keeps out people, but forces people inside, and what your opinions are about it, and do you think that, what do you think we should do against North Korea?
So I think you're talking about the demilitarized zone and the fact that I'm not sure there's a physical wall there, but there is certainly barbed wire and barriers, and right. So I think again, the UN agenda and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights argues that the community of nations, which it's been doing, right, has to continue to apply pressure on a nation that that tortures its own citizens, starves its own citizens. And you could just go on and on. It's just a catalog of tyranny, right? And I think the argument of the United Nations is not to, and this declaration is not to go to war against them, right? Because, I mean, the results of war are always greater than their benefits. The innocent almost always suffer, right? But we need to find ways, whether it's through sanctions, right? To bring them to the table, and you probably noticed that I'm a critic of President Trump, but at the same time, that's one thing that you have to give him credit for, right? That he's brought North Korea closer to the table. I didn't like his style, of belligerence, right? But history will indicate, he may have had that right to call his opponent's bluff, right? But I do think that sanctions and the community of nations is what the UN advocates. So to get China to join us, in making sure that can't go on is very important. Does that help? So I think these walls can come down like the Berlin Wall came down, but only if nobody sort of participates, and just sort of says it's unacceptable. We have to be clear about its unacceptability. In part, and again, President Nunes, I'll be done in 1 second. That gives the people internally the confidence to dissent, right, and to protest. But if the rest of the world ignores them, then they have no hope, right? It's just futile because in a tyranny, you're just going to lose your life. You're just going to lose.
Mm-hmm. Please, is that Jay-Z? Yeah.
As what you were talking about, I agree. It is problematic. But the problem also is that the UN can't agree in the first place on what to do. Every time there's a vote and stuff on the council, they don't agree. You got Russia overruling it. You got Kuwait right now, as we speak, that's in it. They're against a lot of the things that America is putting in place. You got China who's overruling everything else. No one can agree and nothing can get passed. And because of that, nothing can be done.
Well, that's a great speech, but it's not true. Because the United Nations accomplished this, right? So what you're simply describing is the state of the community of nations and what we theologians would simply call sin, right? But it's also positively diversity. So I mean, there is a lot that's gotten done, but what you're stating is the obvious problem, and I recognize it. I don't want to make fun of it, right? But to have 1 billion people, just think of that. As President Nunes told me before we came here, that is the largest number of people raised out of abject poverty in the history of the world, right?
In the last 10 years.
In the last 10 years. I mean, that's a result of the United Nations. Okay, so that's a result of all these nations fighting with each other and disagreeing with each other about their self-interest, right? But if we can get people, to a kind of common self-interest.
Right.
I used to be a pastor in the city of Baltimore and trained in community organizing, and we were taught that self-interest is not necessarily bad. But what you have to do is get people to agree on self-interest. So, for example, we all live on the same globe. Let's make sure, that hurricanes aren't as intense as they are. You see the point? Let's find the common interest. And you're exactly right. we haven't succeeded in that in every instance. But the UN is designed to try to achieve that. It is just painfully slow.
It's painfully slow, it's messy, and it's and Aristotle says politics is free people deliberating the question, how ought we order our lives together? And it's a slow, that's the democratic politics.
Right.
And it's a slow process, but it's the sort of best process we have and the only process we have. And I don't know a better hope than the UN in terms of negotiating, or a place or a table at which these issues are negotiated. But they're slow and they're painful and they're messy.
Part of the course that we taught together, just because the widow of Ofred Nolde, the faculty member, endowed the course and made it possible for students to go to the commissions and hear them, right? And they would come back saying, the Commission on Women, for example, was just so frustrating, right? Because the nations, people were describing the conditions, right? And then the ambassadors would get up and whitewash the whole issue, right? Saying what kind of progress there was. But then, our church's representative to the United Nations said, but notice what's happening. The nations have to come up with a speech about that issue. There's a kind of accountability. They're in a forum, and they, whether all of what they say is true or not, right? They do have to defend themselves on the issue of the status of women, right? Or the status of indigenous people, or you get the point, right? And it's painfully slow, but it's still a part of the accountability that okay?
Hi.
I have more of a comment, and maybe you can let me know your thoughts. When you said about self-interest, so I work in the medical field, and I hear a lot of opinions, and I find that majority of people have the same interest. It's just that they're overloaded. So dealing with African Americans being killed by law enforcement or other members, women being harassed, all the issues that we have, it's so much, and the news and the media sensationalize it so much that we've stopped being empathetic and become apathetic. And it's more so that we don't want to deal, so we just say forget it. I look at the civil rights movements back in the 60s and 70s, and things were so egregious, they kept protesting, whereas we protested 2 months.
Yeah.
We protested 3
Yeah.
months, and they were done because
On to the next thing.
and
Yeah.
something else has happened.
Yeah.
Something else has happened.
Yeah.
And I believe that we need to forget our own insecurities. We need to forget, okay, we're going to be judged, so what? We all have the common goal is to be loved. So why not love one another? And I believe that if we can just forget what we look like, what we sound like, what we feel like, and talk to one another and realize we are all in this together, that we can make change happen.
That's exactly it. I have no comment. I can't
You preached it. You preached it.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions? This is a faculty member. You need to be forewarned here. She is a historian. She's brilliant. Okay.
I don't know about that, but it's a beautiful title for your talk. There's something that doesn't level wall, but obviously in the age of Trump, there is something that does level wall.
But it's a Stone Age savage, says the poet. That's not
It's the
me.
poet,
That's
yeah.
the poet.
But I'm wondering if you could explain more the phenomena of Trump. Why has he done so well in America over the past few years, really? I mean, how do you explain it? I mean, we've heard all these wonderful things, but how then do you? I mean, and they say that immigration is the
Easy one.
primary issue that has put him over the top.
So my wife is from the Midwest. She was born near Peoria, Illinois. and most of her relatives, and ancestors are from states like Illinois and Missouri. And she's trying to trace her family roots. And so this Bostonian agreed to go on a few trips with her to all these little towns in Illinois, Missouri, I think I can say it right.
Missouri.
Missouri?
Yes.
I thought they say Missouri.
Well, that's the way they say it, but that's not the way we say it.
Oh, I see. I learned something, President Nunes. But anyway, when we would go into these towns along the Mississippi or the Missouri River, that were her ancestors, she came from some means, owned a hotel, owned a bank, owned, part of the market street, the commercial street. There was nothing, Professor, left but post-to-post farming. The center of town was a silo, not even a diner, and the people were as mad as
the Dickens.
Because they were left out of what has happened in the rest of the more urbanized Northeast and maybe upper Midwest, etc. So what we missed was the anger of the people who have been left out of our prosperity. The folks that President Nunes lifted up, 1 out of 6, right? I tell you, anger that I just did not expect, right? And churches that don't have any people anymore. Pastors are back to the old colonial days where they might serve 4 or 5 churches in their itinerants because the area, the towns are so depopulated, and I can't really exaggerate, kind of the wasteland that has come about as a result of agribusiness, and so much that so trailer parks in the middle of these lovely old towns where my wife would say, this is where my grandfather's hotel was. This is where because we had pictures of it, right? And I think that has brought about a demagogue, who has cultivated hate speech, right? Cultivated division, cultivated angry rhetoric, and blaming that just, and then finding an enemy, right? The outsider, that just feeds that anger that's already there. And rather than, really, I mean, they're not going to be helped by the current policy.
So the coal mines aren't coming back?
No. They won't. They're closing down even now, because natural gas is so much cheaper. So, does that help? I think we missed a lot of people, and gave, somebody who's more interested in power than anything else, the opportunity to run the country. And I'm really fearful for democracy, the future of democracy, because so many people just feel helpless, in the face of the real powerful forces that have been let loose. You asked me. I may be wrong. You're the historian. I'm a medieval historian. I know nothing about current events.
One more?
Good evening. You said a lot of interesting things, and one of the things that you said that touched me was we have to get to see people and then know them. And I think that's one of the issues. We say we don't see color, but that's not true. You have to first see color, recognize color, and move beyond that. And what the answer you just gave, I think, is brilliant, but I think it's half of it. The other part, I think, comes from, and I hope you can answer me, is we talked about the walls keeping people out, but what are we trying to keep in? And I think what we're trying to keep in is part of the problem.
as you can tell us what you think we're trying to keep in. Or when I say we, I say that very loosely. What are the powers that we try to keep in that they don't want others to be a part of?
So what, and President Nunes will have the right answer. This is just my quick response, right? And I'm going to just say this flat out. I'm a very, as you probably could tell, I'm a very blunt person. What a significant portion of this country wants to do is keep white people in control. White people are very afraid when they're afraid they might lose control. We have been socialized to running things. And when it looks like we may not be in control, we get very, very scared. I mean, look, a lot of what's happened, in this nation as a result of Obama having been elected as president. The other thing that is a result of what we see is so many scholars predicted that in 2050 there'll be no ethnic group that will be in the majority in this country, right? Scared the bejeebers, right? Out of those who now are talking about nationalism, what they really mean is white nationalism. So that's what they want. Am I answering your question? That's what they want to keep. That's what they want to keep.
Well, thanks for coming and stirring things up here, Phil. My goodness.
Well, it's what folks who look like me, are afraid of.
Yeah. Could you join me, please, in thanking our guest, Dr. Phil Krey?